I just,
Like I said, the more you travel, the more it's like it's the same.
People please and creative
I'm very happy and flattered that you invited me to chat with you about some matters that are very much in my arena of concern. I would like to commend you for being serious and for being interested in listening to what I might have to say. I hope that we will be able to exchange a few ideas in the very few minutes that I have to be with you today. I'd like to bring you greetings from the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, which is an organization, an international organization of African people. We established the organization in 1984 in Los Angeles. We have about 750 members. Most of them are in the States, the United States, a few in Canada, one or two in London, one or two in Kingston, and a few on the continent of Africa. But we are open to all African people, and I would be happy to supply any information you want. Also from the Kemetic Institute, which is a local organization that is affiliated with the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. It's an organization that I had a hand in founding about 15 years ago. Both of those organizations are very vital in the movement that I'm associated with, and I'll tell you a little about that in a few minutes. And finally, the place I work, the Center for Inner City Studies, which is a part of Northeastern Illinois University. We have had a Center for Inner City Studies for about 25 years now. We came to being, so to speak, in the midst of the urban rebellions by the African American populations in many of the cities of the United States during the middle 1960s. Our program was originally designed to retrain teachers who were teaching in the inner city, to give them a better sense of what they ought to be doing in relating to the inner city community and its concerns and issues and problems. But we very quickly expanded to a program that was directed toward the retraining and the training of all individuals who wanted to establish their careers in the inner city studies, in the inner city arena. And we have had a great deal of success with that, because what we've tried to do is to teach the people in the inner city and the workers, the people who work in the inner city, that the basic problem is to generate the kind of power that the people need in order to change their lives in a positive direction in all of the dimensions of society: employment, education, health, and so forth and so on. And so we've had a very successful career over the last quarter of a century. And we have been able to withstand attempts to uproot us and to put us out of the community. And ultimately, I think we have made some peace with the powers that be, that at least some of the powers that be are willing to admit that we are here to stay, even though they might not want us to stay. The major projects of the association that I told you about a few minutes ago in the Kemetic Institute are the major objective, rather, is the restoration of African civilization. We feel that it is necessary for the ultimate rehabilitation of African people all over the world, wherever they are, people of African descent all over the world, that we have a very substantial restoration of African civilization. It is necessary for these people to become whole people in order for African people to recapture their humanity in totality. That African civilization has to be restored and rehabilitated because it has been so abused and so denied and so deformed and so mutilated in the intellectual and other programs of the last several hundred years. So we are dedicated to the restoration of African civilization. We feel that it's good not only for people of African descent, however, we feel that it's good for the entire world. We feel that it's good for everybody because it is the truth. It is the truth, and the truth should be in everybody's interest. But whatever the case, the world as it exists today confronts many problems, and some of those problems appear to be horrendous. And many of those problems have to do with intergroup relations and interethnic and intercultural relations. And we feel that the restoration of African civilization will be a positive benefit into correcting many of the problems that confront the world today. And we feel that that is in the interest not just of African people, but all people. We have in the United States, and particularly in Chicago, which is my base, we have been advancing a couple of specific projects that we feel are vital in the context of our ultimate objective. One is the establishment of a world history from an African perspective. That is, we call it the World History Project. One of the problems with the history that we have access to now, and that is used primarily in the curricula and in the general worldview, we feel that that history is biased against African people, biased against many other peoples of the world, that it is basically Eurocentric, and it exaggerates the European contribution to world history, and it debases the contribution, especially of African people, and we feel that that needs to be corrected, and our project is directed toward the correction of that, because if this world is going to be put together in the future in the interest of all people, it's going to have to be put together on the basis of correct history rather than incorrect history. And the second project that we're involved in is what we call the African-Centered Curriculum. And that is a project that has gotten us into a great intellectual controversy, an intellectual war, so to speak. Practically everybody outside of the African community in the United States is opposed to this project. And we feel that the opposition to it is both substantial, that is that it is deep seated, and we feel also that it is based upon a lack of understanding of what we're trying to do, even though we feel that there will be many who will be opposed to it if they understand what we're trying to do. But nonetheless, it is a fairly successful movement in the United States, and we have been able to work with the entire African community throughout the United States in pushing this project. For example, in Chicago, we have recently worked very cooperatively with the African American politicians. At the state level, we have an African American state legislative black caucus, as we call it. The Black Caucus, in looking at what we are trying to accomplish and finally understanding what we are trying to do in terms of educational reform, initiated and pushed through the Illinois state legislature a bill that requires the teaching of African and African American history in all schools in Illinois. And while that doesn't solve our problem, it certainly does give us a start in the right direction. It does legitimize what we are attempting to do. They were able to convince the European American legislators of the necessity of doing this. And that, of course, gives us some kind of base to operate from. In addition to that, we have recently called upon the Black Caucus to protect our center from some of the attacks against our center. That is, many of the people who are opposed to what we are doing have complained about our programs and accused us of reverse racism and all those sort of horrendous crimes. Some very powerful people tried a few months ago to see if they could close our educational program down. And we got wonderful cooperation from the black legislators, and they put the issue straight and explained it very calmly to the rest of the members of the legislature. And that program was stopped and halted, so we have another lease on life. In addition to that, we have been working with the local school councils. I don't know if you know it, but in Chicago, they have decentralized educational policy making to a considerable extent, and every school has a local school council that deals with matters of budget, matters of hiring the principal and hiring the teachers, as well as the content of the curriculum. And we have been working with, there are 490 of those in Chicago. And we've been working with about 100 of them over the last 2 years toward the implementation of the African-centered curriculum. And these councils are predominantly made up of African-American parents. Parents who have been concerned with the poor education that their children have been receiving over the years. Parents who are searching for a formula that will enable their children to succeed in the educational arena. And we've been working with those parents, and many of them have decided to establish an African-centered curriculum in their schools, and it's working very well. Because you see, the African-centered curriculum, while it is called an African-centered curriculum, is really a curriculum which aims at establishing the truth about world history and world civilization. We center it around African experience because that's the experience of the consuming population. But what we actually are doing is correcting the falsification that permeates what is called the standard curriculum. The falsification that results in an image of Africa and its contributions as inferior. And we are having great success in that, because what we do is to insist that you teach correctly about Africa, not only in the social studies and the humanities, but also in terms of the history of science and the history of mathematics and in art and music and in all phases of the curriculum. We have established some criteria that we feel are very important. Among those are balance. We believe that when you teach about Africa, that you must bring balance to that teaching. It's all right to talk about the oral tradition among Africans, but you must also point out that in addition to having an excellent oral tradition, many African societies also have excellent written traditions. In other words, the idea of Africa as being pre-literate is not acceptable simply because it's not the truth. We also insist that you not only teach about the rural culture among African people, but that you also teach about the urban cultures among African people. That African people not only live in cities today, but African people established cities throughout history. African cities were developed by African people before outsiders came in. And those cities are very important in understanding the development of what we call world history. So we teach about the urban tradition and dispel the idea that African peoples were across the board pre-urban. We also deal with the idea of thought, especially deep thought. African peoples are often said to be pre-logical. Much of the literature emphasizes that African people's thought was somewhat juvenile and so forth and so on. And what we are doing is proving by looking at African literature and African traditions to show that African peoples had deep thinking that was on a par with anything that Europeans at a comparable period of history developed in the line of thinking. All of that is designed to correct that which has been deformed and mutilated about what has gone on in the world. We also insist that the curriculum be multicultural. Even though we are talking about an African-centeredness in predominantly African schools, we are saying that the curriculum nonetheless must be multicultural, that African children should learn even more than they learn about other cultures. We aren't by any means saying that the only culture that African people ought to be exposed to is African culture. We want our children to know as much about European culture, as much about Asian culture, as much about the culture, the indigenous culture of the Western Hemisphere as is appropriate in terms of the way this world really is. We feel that that is possible if we change our way of thinking about teaching, if we change our way of thinking about the basic framework. We also insist, though, that certain things still have to be race-specific. This is one of the most controversial parts of our agenda, but for example, the Europeans have denied, for the most part, for the last several centuries, that the ancient Egyptians were African people. They claim that the ancient Egyptians were Caucasians. They claim that the ancient Egyptians came from someplace else and established that civilization. Our research, which we think is as creditable or more creditable than most of the European research that reaches that opinion, establishes substantially that the ancient Egyptian people were African people, and that the ancient Egyptian civilization was an African civilization in the full sense of the word. And that should be taught specifically so that when African children and any other children look at the civilizations of antiquity, they can understand that Egyptian civilization was African, Mesopotamian civilization was Western Asian, and Greek civilization was European. And then they can make the necessary comparisons and so forth and so on. Fourth, we believe and insist that the curriculum is integrated, that when you teach about Africa, you teach about Africa holistically, that Africans had thoughts in every domain of knowledge, that Africans had experience in every domain. Africans experienced time every minute that everybody else experienced time. Africans didn't just jump in history at one point and then disappear and then jump back in history at another point and have this sporadic appearance in history as most of the European-oriented history books teach us. Africans lived life like everybody else continuously. Africans had failures and successes like all other peoples. That's important. When we teach about Africa, we also have to teach about the failures. I mean, we can't ignore the weaknesses and the flaws. We aren't asking for that sort of thing. All we want is the truth. And finally, and that is what I want to say, the final one is truth. We absolutely insist that you don't invent anything about Africa. You don't have to invent anything about Africa to make Africa look good. You don't have to invent anything about Africa to make Africa look normal. All you have to do is tell the truth. What we are doing is fighting against falsehood, and therefore we should not, by any means, in fighting against falsehood, establish falsehood or try to establish lies. That's our basic program, and we feel that that is a program that is good for all African people of African descent, wherever they are. We have been in the African diaspora for several centuries. We have struggled with every imaginable type of program to achieve what some of us call equality and respectability, and we have not succeeded yet. We feel that the program that we are now pushing will bring us a long way toward a reconstruction of world civilization that will provide an equal footing for all the peoples. And so that's what we are about, and I would be very happy to entertain any questions or comments that you may have in relation to that.
I should get it right. Kemet.
The African World.
And The African Worldview. I would recommend that to a lot of you. It's a very inspiring book, amongst other works. We're fortunate to have him here in Southwark at short notice, thanks to the Hackney Black People's Association and Sonia, her kindness to lend Professor Carruthers to us for the short moment that we have with him. I would urge you all to try and make the lectures that he is giving throughout this week before his departure back to the States. Anyway, what we're going to do now for half an hour is let Professor Carruthers expand on a few of the themes that he wants to draw our attentions to. But before that, to have questions and answers on his introduction, which he's given to us. And Clive Anderson from the Race Equality Unit will chair this session. So the floor is now open for you to feed back and ask Professor Carruthers some questions on what he's just presented to you.
Chair, pardon me for putting a question to Professor Carruthers. With regards to one of superiority of races, you speak of truth, and then you speak, with regards to the Afrocentric perspective, you speak of truth and you also speak of denouncing falsehood. Where, if I may ask, do you stand where do you stand with regards to what's perceived as extremism by, say, the legacy that Malcolm X left us, and, say, the politicians that gave support to the movement that you're part of?
Well, I thank you for that question. I have never observed, I was a part of the African American public throughout the civil rights movement. In fact, I was involved in it quite a bit from the activist position. And I paid special attention to Malcolm X throughout his career. And I never viewed Malcolm X as being extreme in anything. To me, Malcolm X was always very logical. I suppose that one of the things that might be associated with extremism where Malcolm X was concerned was his advocacy of defensive violence. In order to understand that, I think you have to understand what we were subjected to and what we are still to some extent subjected to in terms of offensive violence. During the time Malcolm X talked about defensive violence, we were being physically abused and intimidated by the people who opposed our attempt to dismantle the segregation system. And all he was saying to some of the members of the movement was that you had better stop being nonviolent and start defending yourself, because some of you are going to get killed. And as it turned out, quite a number got killed. So that, I think, is about the only thing I can think of that would be called extremism in Malcolm X's program, and I thoroughly supported that. The politicians among the African Americans suffer from all of the faults and attributes that the rest of us suffer from. Some of our politicians have been extremely, in my judgment, have been extremely positive and extremely group-oriented, and have really worked to advance the causes that benefit us. Other African-American politicians have been corrupt, have sold out, and have been, in general, a part of the problem and a part of the oppressive forces. But I find that to be true everywhere, not just simply in the United States, but also on the continent of Africa and wherever African-American people are. And not just simply restricted to African people, that's restricted. I mean, European people suffer from the same kind of problems, too.
Quite impressively about multicultural programs in schools, and it's an area in Britain that's quite young and becoming quite controversial because the old tradition is protecting the change. How do you think we should go about dealing with that kind of struggle here? Do you think we need political legislation, as in your case, in Chicago to help that process, or should the teachers kind of lead that movement?
I think that a movement to do what we are trying to do, and that is to reform the curriculum of white supremacy, and replace it with a curriculum that is based upon the reality of the multicultural world that we are in, is a movement that necessarily must be multifaceted, that we must attack the problem at every level that we can possibly exercise some influence on. And therefore, I would say that we need to, yes, approach it from the political standpoint and try to get some legislative support for it. Legislation isn't going to solve the problem by any means. I mean, you can get all the statutes that you might be able to pass, and you still won't get a positive result unless something else happens. But legislative support doesn't hurt. It shouldn't hurt, and it should be used to give you an extra advantage and a little leverage. It should also be used to increase the level of awareness of the general public, because the public has a tendency to look at legislation and to at least discuss it and entertain it. And if it passed, they at least, some of them will suspect that there might be something to it. But certainly at the level of the teachers, you have to depend upon the teachers for the actual implementation of your project. If you don't get the teachers, it's not going to work. The teachers are on the line. They are in the war zone, so to speak, if I can use that term, and I don't mean any harm by it. But the teachers are there, and if the teachers don't carry out the program, then the program isn't going on. What we have been fortunate enough to do in Chicago is through our educational program, we have trained 700 or 800 teachers directly, people who've gotten their degree, their college degrees through us, either at the undergraduate or the graduate level. Then, in addition to those programs, we have been working with the Chicago public school system with a program we call Teaching About Africa, where teachers come every other Saturday for about 16 weeks and get lectures on Africa, various aspects of African culture and civilization. And then in the afternoons of those sessions, we have teacher trainers who work with them, teaching them how to develop strategies about the most successful inclusion of ideas and materials about Africa into the curriculum. In that program, we've touched about 1,000 teachers over the last 10 years. So we have had a pretty good influence on the teaching, just that level. But also, many of our students over the years have moved up in the school hierarchy. That is, they've left the classroom and become principals and curriculum coordinators and administrators in various fields. And we have one of our students who is an associate superintendent of schools in Chicago. And that's not just Chicago, but it's also other places in the States. And therefore, we have a large group of people throughout the school system who are sympathetic with what we are trying to push, who understand the necessity of it, and who are willing to use their power and their authority and their offices to push it. And so we have brought those people together in many meetings and contexts to affect this program. So now we have a broad base. Finally, we have worked, as I said, with the local school councils, with the parents, because the program isn't going to work unless the parents are involved in it. I will promise you that. Anytime you're talking about something as vital as culture, anytime you're talking about something as vital as changing a cultural orientation, you're going to have the parents involved in it. So we have been working with the local school council. In fact, we were a part of the political movement to get the power to the parents, to give parents the power to make decisions about the education of their children. And so we work with them politically, and now we're working with them in terms of curriculum reform. And so we have a broad base of support, and we constantly seek other areas and avenues of support. support. We have started talking with some of the members of the business communities to help us in this endeavor. And we feel that by developing that kind of consensus, we'll have a solid base. So whatever the political fortunes may be, the base will be there and the program will continue. One other thing that I think we have to realize is that this program should not be restricted to the public school. We have to push it into public schools because our children go to public schools. The law requires that children go to school for a certain period of time. And parents who aren't able to send their children to private school or unwilling to send their children to private schools have to send their children to public schools. So we have to go into the public schools and influence that curriculum, you see. But we understand that the whole job cannot be done and will not be done in public schools, that we also have to have private schools and supplemental educational programs. We have such a program. My little group has a program. We call it the Classical African Academy. And on Saturdays, many children come into our program and receive that kind of supplemental education. We try to coordinate that education with what they are actually studying in the classroom. Because what we're talking about has all kinds of implications for quality education. We aren't saying substitute this for quality education. We are saying that inlay this with quality education. We want more and higher quality education for our children. We want our children to have the best education in the world. And so we have to have a total approach to the education of our children. And finally, one final thing. We believe that it's not just simply a matter of educating children. It's a matter of educating everybody. Everybody has to be educated. So what we are in the business of doing is establishing study groups. We've even convinced some of our politicians to establish a study group for politicians, where when they find a time, when they can find some time that they're not politicking, they come together and they study African culture and world culture in general and inform themselves. We have parents in study groups. We have school administrators in study groups. We have organized study groups in churches. And so it's a total approach. And we commend that to you because you can't always get a formal program because of various circumstances. You may have too small a population. You may not have enough political power. You may not have enough influence with the teachers or the administrators and so forth and so on. But the education has to go on, and the parents have to assume that responsibility. So that was a long answer.
Academic research and study that you have within America. And I would like to know whether you do have an international perspective and an international program of disseminating that kind of zeal in academic research about African identity and history.
Classical African Civilizations is really designed to be an international intellectual development organization where we establish an international research program and an international educational program. One of our objectives, I mentioned just a couple of the projects, but one of our objectives is to establish what we call an African education system, which would be an international African education system, where we can generate the kinds of research and the kinds of academic excellence that are necessary to fuel this whole project that we're involved in. We haven't made a great deal of headway. We worked with Professor Cheikh Anta Diop until he died on this idea. We are now working with, let us say, Professor Obenga, who was one of his disciples and who is still continuing the work. We have opened our membership to people from all over the world who are Africans, and we have a few scattered out, as I said, throughout the world. We hope that we will be able to do what you are suggesting in terms of the international propagation of our projects. Whenever African students come to the States, we do try to get them involved in what we're doing, and some of them respond. We have a group of Cheikh Anta Diop students now who are studying in the States, and they are very much a part of our work. But what we did, if you notice the history of the movement in the States, what we did, and our students were really the ones who kind of revived our momentum in this direction in the 1960s with the Black Studies movement. The Black Studies movement challenged us. That is, I was a very young teacher in the 1960s, and my students came back demanding a number of things, including Black Studies. I wasn't equipped at that time to deal with the issue of Black Studies, but because of my students' enthusiasm over it, because I saw them light up in a sense that I had never seen them light up before, I started re-educating myself, you see, and getting ready to offer some assistance to their aspirations and so forth and so on. And what we did as that movement grew, and as we were called upon, the so-called educated Negroes in those days, as we were called on to solve that problem for them, we went into those universities, including me. I went into a university at that call to help keep the black students pacified. But what we saw was that we ought to take advantage of that and create positive educational programs that would lead to the true intellectual and academic development of our people. And so we were able to, some of us, very patiently stop the loud kind of politics and very quietly started putting together quality programs that can stand accreditation, review, and all that sort of thing, that can stand any standards of excellence, you know. And so we have a solid program. And nobody can argue about the quality of our programs or the quality of our graduates, because our graduates can compete with anybody in similar fields, you see, and do themselves quite well. So that's the kind of thing that we've done. And here and there throughout the United States, those programs have been repeated. Also, you cannot underplay the community education program. Every Saturday, from 9 o'clock in the morning until at least 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we are teaching members of the community on a volunteer. I mean, they come in, they pay $5 tuition, you know, just to take care of Xeroxing and things like that. And we teach them consistently, year after year after year after year. People from all walks of life. Some of them are educated, so-called, and some of them are not educated, but we teach them. And therefore, we establish a broad base for the notion of the kind of education that we are supplying. And that's what you have to do. Eventually, you will convert some of your scholars, some African scholars here, African British scholars, I don't know the terminology to use. Eventually, you will convert some. Eventually, some will come across and start devoting their talents to this project, because they will see that they have a vital interest in that project. You have to have patience. You have to have endurance.
I wanted to ask Professor Carruthers one final question. In terms of definition and how we define ourselves, one of the biggest problems I find within the community here in Britain is not only the lack of understanding amongst ourselves of Africans in the Caribbean and Africans from the continent who have an interface either in the workplace or in social encounters here. There is a lack of understanding of either who we are and where we're coming from. We have a great deal of terms of reference to each other which do not do justice to not only our historical inheritance, but our position in terms of where we want to go collectively.
Sure.
And I wondered if in the States you've overcome that.
Sure. Yeah, we have, we've had a running debate for 200 years over what we ought to be called. 200 years ago, we were called Africa in the United States, you know, the African Methodist Church, the African Free Societies, and so forth and so on. And then all of a sudden somebody suggested that African wasn't the proper term, and we started using the term color. And so for a half century or more, we were colored. And then somebody decided that was inappropriate, and we decided to start using Negro. When I was a boy, that's what we were using, Negro. And so when I was coming up as a young militant Negro, I would, if you call me colored, I'd say, hey, I'm not colored. Colored's on the palm. I'm a Negro, you know. And then in the 1960s, my students got insulted when I used Negro and said, I'm black. You know, and so I use black, you know. And then in the 1970s, when we really got involved in this thing, we started using the term African, because African is the best term in our estimation that can define those things that you referred to, our common origin, our common destiny, our common experience. To the extent that we have all of those things in common, it is our Africanness that lends positive as well as negative things to us. One of the things that one of my mentors is Cheikh Anta Diop. One of the things that he said that pointed out that I thought was so very, very critical was that I don't care where you are, if you are of African descent, you have cultural citizenship only in Africa. You have cultural citizenship only in Africa. And that I don't know, you have to think about it. I can't explain it, just think about it. Cheikh Anta Diop says your cultural citizenship is in Africa. And that says it all. It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
State education system as obtained in the United States. And of course, that's of critical importance in terms of controlling the local management of the schools. We've had campaigns for black governance, etc. That's just a point of information. But what I was particularly concerned about is how you fund yourself, how you support yourself economically. When I heard you refer to being on a serious track from the system in Chicago, I knew, and you survived, I knew immediately that you didn't have any state funding. I assumed that.
Sure.
So, I mean, that's a very important issue, because I feel that over the, for the 60s and 70s in this country, the black community has been underdeveloped and in fact demobilized by state funding and dependency on the state. So I was just wondering if you have any comments on how you fund yourself.
Well, I think what I say may be somewhat disappointing. In the first place, I have a job. That's important. I get paid for teaching. I don't want to underplay the importance and the seriousness of your question, but let me just point that out. I do have a job, and therefore I don't have to worry about myself in that sense. And so all the time that I'm not performing my official duties as an employee of the state, I can use to advance this cause. So a lot of what we are doing takes advantage of people who are employed, who are willing to commit all of their time out of the office or whatever they do to advancing the cause. Much of what we do is just simply the beneficiary of voluntary effort. Our basic fundamental grounding is that what we are doing is so important that it must be done whether we have funding or not. Once you decide that, then things begin to happen. We do get funding here and there, but we don't depend on it. We have learned the lesson. Some of us did get big grants after the rebellions. You know how the so-called riots always produce benevolence. Some of us did get it, and many of them who got hooked on grants the way our children sometimes now are getting hooked on crack. And getting hooked on a grant is worse in many respects than getting hooked on crack. You know what I mean? So one of the things you have to do is make certain that you don't depend on funding in that sense. Then you look at your resources and you take an inventory of all of your resources, and then you begin to pull those resources together and make your program work. And a lot of times when people see that your program is working regardless, somehow or another they get a little more benevolent. And they say, well, you people need something, but you take it on your terms, and you take it with an understanding of your staff that when this goes, in case this paramour gets bored or bitter and leaves us, we will not, stop functioning. You see what I'm saying? That's very important. That's very important. We've gotten money from the Chicago school system to run our Teaching About Africa program because they know we're going to run it anyway. And they have finally decided that they would rather be involved in it than excluded from it. And so they fund us. You see what I'm saying? But we have the attitude that we will take the money if it's available. If not, we will find a way to do it. And that's what I think you have to sort of resolve to do. Then everybody will know you're serious.
I've been informed to explain to you that drinks and our refreshments are available. But before you do go, those of you, I'd just like to make an announcement if I may, get in here. Before you do go, those within the local authority, next Tuesday at 12:30, we're going to have a meeting for the Black Workers AGM. So it's imperative that the workers that are here from all the departments, we're setting up a working party so that we can have elections. We're setting up a working party, so it's essential that you... Please don't interrupt me. It's essential that you tell the members of your departments that you come from. 12:30 on Tuesday. Once again, please, can I just say thanks very much for Professor Carruthers to come at such short notice and such erudite and giving us such excellent instructions as to how we should conduct ourselves within the council and our community generally. Please.
Supplement, just before we acknowledge Dr. Carruthers, I have photocopies of a series of lectures that he's given throughout London. So if you're interested, hold on, I'll get them from the car. The other thing as well is that we need to all meet. Those of us who are committed and found the time to be here, I'd like to thank you for not making it an embarrassment for the organisers, Errol, Sonia and myself and Clive this afternoon. It shows your commitment. We've got a long way to go. Thank you all. And thank you in particular, Dr. Carruthers.